Welcome to AudioVerse Listening Library, where every word awakens the power within. You don't need more willpower, you need fewer temptations. In this chapter, we uncover why self-control is not a moral virtue, but a design strategy. Welcome to Chapter 4 of Atomic Habits, where we decode the secret to self-control. Beginning with deep summary, James Clear begins this chapter with the insight that disciplined people aren't stronger in self-control. They're simply exposed to fewer temptations. He contrasts our cultural obsession with grit and willpower against the practical truth. Success is less about resisting bad habits and more about removing the cues that trigger them. Through examples such as soldiers overcoming addiction during the Vietnam War, Clear illustrates how environment change leads to behavior change, not the other way around. When the soldiers returned to a different environment, their addictions largely disappeared, proving that context, not character, determines consistency. The chapter encourages readers to focus not on fighting impulses, but on reengineering their surroundings, making good habits obvious and bad habits invisible. In short, self-control is a short-term strategy, but environment design is a long-term solution. Change begins not with effort, but with awareness. James Clear explains that most of our habits run on autopilot, invisible programs guiding our days. To change them, we must first see them. That's the first law of behavior change. Make it obvious. The problem isn't a lack of motivation. It's a lack of visibility. You can't fix what you can't notice. Clear invites us to become scientists of our own behavior, to observe, not judge. He suggests a simple exercise called the Habits Scorecard. Write down everything you do in a typical day and mark each habit as positive, negative, or neutral. You'll be surprised how many of your actions happen without conscious choice. Awareness creates power. When you name your habits, you begin separating yourself from them. Instead of me lazy, you start to see, I often open my phone first thing in the morning. Once it's visible, you can redesign it. The next idea is implementation intention, turning vague desires into concrete plans. Don't say, I'll exercise more. Say, I will walk for 10 minutes at 7 a.m. in the park. The clearer the cue, the easier the follow-through. Environment becomes your silent partner. Clear gives a simple but powerful technique, habit stacking. You attach a new habit to an existing one. After I pour my morning coffee, I will meditate for 1 minute. The existing routine becomes the cue for the new behavior. Slowly, your day becomes a chain of intentional acts, one habit triggering the next. Now, AudioVerse Listening Library will take his listeners on a journey of deep dive with philosophical, scientific, and psychological insights of this chapter. From a philosophical lens, this chapter mirrors the Stoic idea that freedom is not achieved by resisting desires, but by mastering the conditions that create them. Epictetus taught, freedom is the right use of impressions, meaning our reactions are shaped by what we allow into our minds and senses. In modern terms, that's exactly what Clear means by controlling your environment. You manage what reaches your attention. This also parallels Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhist mindfulness, where self-mastery is achieved not by suppression, but by removing triggers of attachment. Thus, James Clear's approach modernizes ancient wisdom. Instead of fighting temptation, one must cultivate harmony with one's surroundings. Scientifically and psychologically, behavioral psychology supports Clear's view through cue-response theory. Every habit begins with a cue that prompts a craving, leading to a response and reward. When cues are reduced or redesigned, the habit loop weakens. Studies on addiction, cognitive load, and decision fatigue all confirm that environmental cues shape 90% of behavior automatically. For example, if your phone is beside you while you study, it's not your lack of discipline that breaks focus. It's the brain's natural salience response to potential novelty. Thus, designing your physical and digital environments is an act of neuroscience-informed self-compassion. AudioVerse's listeners can understand this with real-life examples. The Vietnam study. 15% of American soldiers became addicted to heroin overseas. When they returned home, only 5% relapsed, demonstrating the power of environmental change. Office layouts. Companies like Google and Apple design workspaces to encourage creative habits and discourage burnout, proof that culture is architectural. Personal example. Leaving your running shoes beside your bed is more effective than relying on morning motivation. The cue replaces effort. Contrast and comparison. Traditional self-help teaches discipline and determination. Clear's model shifts that paradigm. Discipline is not resistance, it's alignment. While most people try to overpower bad habits through force, Clear advocates friction-based behavior design. Make bad habits harder and good ones easier. This echoes psychological contrast with Freud's model of repression, suppressing instinct, versus behaviorist modification, changing stimulus. The former drains energy, the latter builds systems. So far, the critique view and limitations of this chapter is, while Clear's argument is scientifically grounded, critics note that not all environments are within personal control. Socioeconomic limits, cultural conditioning, or shared spaces can restrict design flexibility. Hence, while the principle is universally true, its execution requires creative adaptation, using digital, mental, or social boundaries when physical control isn't possible. However, even under constraints, awareness of environmental influence remains empowering. It shifts blame from moral weakness to strategic readiness. The secret to self-control isn't in fighting the old, it's in designing the new. In the next chapter, we'll discover how habits grow stronger when they become part of your identity. Stay tuned for Chapter 5, where behavior becomes belief. Until then, keep thinking, keep throwing, and remember, the mind you build builds the life you live.